I'm going to take you back to 1969, when the first movement, it was called the Women's Liberation Movement in those days, actually came across from America, because the original meeting was in Washington at that time, and a group of leftist Marxist women had got together at this very beginning meeting. In essence, they wanted a movement of their own, and they turned on their leftist men, partners and boyfriends and everything else, and said, look, we are going to change the goalposts. We need our own movement. We want our own funding. And there is very little money in left-wing movements. So what we'll do is it will no longer be capitalism that's the problem and that we're going to fight to overcome. We're now going to move it to patriarchy. And I think that's a brilliant strategy. As a branding issue, how better could you get than half the other part of the human race is going to now pay you for your movement that's going to exclude them and create a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar industry over the last 40 years. And year by year, the money gets bigger and bigger. And the numbers of people who fall by the wayside, and certainly the suicide rates for men, the men dragged out of their homes, the laws that are being made to isolate. The original point when I stood up in those great big collectives and pointed out to them that the movement that they created was actually nothing to do with women's needs. They brought to us a Trojan horse. It was called equality, and there needed to be changes made to make women equal in those days. The simple ones were that in my day, you couldn't have contraception from the doctor until you proved that you were getting married. The woman had to actually prove this to the doctor before she was allowed. So you know there was no possibility of abortion. Many, many women died of septicemias and infections. And so, yes, all of us and men welcomed this new movement with open arms. But when I heard what was going on in the collectives, and I heard this, the most chilling phrase to me, and I called it the planned destruction of the family, was that what was said is the new parenting, the new structure would be women and children. That would be the new movement. And men would be disenfranchised because marriage was no longer a safe place, had never been a safe place for women and children. And so gradually the ideas began. At that point, I had fought myself to a standstill with this movement. And where my heart was, even from the very beginning, it was trying to find out, how can you heal totally broken people? How can you love the unlovable? Because that's what I was seeing with the violent, dysfunctional women that came in. So my figure, which ties up with yours, is of the first 100 women that came into my refuge, 62 were as violent and some more violent than the men they left. And the rest were innocent victims of their partner's violence. So as I could understand it, I had to look at women who were just like my mother, incapable of mothering. Like most children, because my mother cried and wept and wailed, I saw her as being totally bullied and intimidated by my father. It took me many years, and I was quite a lot older, when I suddenly recognized my mother threw the bomb and my father exploded. Once you realize that, and I realized it was both of them, and the confusing thing for a child is in that situation there is this massive explosion and crying and wailing and weeping. Next morning they're having breakfast together, while the three of us have been lying shaking in our beds. So this was what I had to actually work. But what came out of it all was the desperate need to learn how to love, to learn how to be loved, to develop tools and strategies for knowing how you can actually get through whatever happens to you without this terrible, terrible rage and violence. How we used to have a sticker that said, people are not for hitting. Children are people too. And on the T-shirts of the kids, we would put that sticker. So when the mother lifted her hand, that sticker was there to remind her. The hardest part of it all was, of course, nobody was at all interested in the idea of healing broken people, to say nothing of the totally damaged kids. Their concern was to try and bury this problem because they did not want it to come up. I wrote the first book in the world on domestic violence. It was called Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear. That was Jeannie's husband said when he was beating her. And I remember she was telling me this, and I said, well, can I use that? It's a fantastic title. And I wrote the book, and I included all the letters. I'd never written a book, so I had all the letters I had and what was happening at that time. And at the end of it, I put a whole list of all the agencies who knew exactly what was going on, and they all queued up to sue me. But then the cat was out of the bag, though. They could no longer pretend this was not an issue because the press got behind it, and so did the public. My problem was they only wanted to hear about innocent victims of partners' violence. What enraged them and made me the enemy was I said, no, but it's not like that. It's not a gender issue. It has nothing to do with patriarchy. That's a whole made-up nonsense. It's actually fraud. At that point, before I actually opened the refuge, the women's movement, both across the Western world, became a very fashionable thing to do. And they did get funding, as thousands of women paid to join this movement. In England, it cost you £3.10, which is quite a lot of money, actually, in the 70s. But that money was running out, so they needed further funding. And this I knew would happen. Even as I actually opened the door and the women poured in, I thought to myself, yeah, this is going to be perfect. It's a perfect issue for a feminist movement who say all men are violent. And it's a perfect funding issue because as long as you make sure that the women are told and everybody is brainwashed into thinking of women as victims, then you have an income and it will become jobs for the girls. And of course, the recruiting areas were in all universities across the Western world. That's where the women professors began the whole women's studies and excluding men. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And as women went into law, they began to change the law, as you know, completely illegal, much of what they've done. Because what they've done is to take a man's right to be innocent before he's proven guilty. That's been taken away. A man, no women, a man has to prove his innocence. And that is the most shocking thing, I think, that has happened in the last 40 years. All now a woman has to do is pick up the phone and he's finished. My attitude towards all this, as other refuges grew, the feminist refuges wouldn't accept alcoholics or women who are drug addicts or women who are violent. So innocent victims of violence who were coming into me, women who just needed refuge but not that much therapy, we moved them on to the refuges. Our people, the people that came in and said and chose, nobody had to do it, but chose to come into this therapeutic program. We also extended that work to take women who were about to lose their children to social services on court orders. They could come into our program. And all men, except in cases where I recognized there was extreme possibility of violence. These are usually men who have been they've been inside for robbery with arms and known violent behavior. Or men who, because of what has happened to them in their childhood, have now developed such a psychotic behavior patterns that they are dangerous to the woman and to the children. But even those men, every single man who wanted to see me or anybody in the refuge who was working there, they were welcome to contact us. We hired, actually to begin with, it was nuns. They were brilliant and comforting, and they would go and visit any father who suddenly found himself without children. We arranged supervised access if the father had been told he couldn't see the children. And as long as we realized that he wasn't dangerous, and actually there was no reason, because by the time the man who had suddenly found himself in this position had come to ask for help, and you actually touch him and you say, look, I'm really sorry this is happening to you, man will then sit down and explain. And one of the most important things is to actually work. We have to take, as far as I'm concerned, we have to take all this out of the hands of courts, out of the hands of lawyers, and we have to put it where it belongs. And it belongs in a whole new era where we look at a totally different way of how we take care of each other. It wasn't about moralizing with people or imposing things on them. It was about saying, I know you want to love and I know you want to be loved. These are the tools that will help. And you were talking about language. Most people from very violent homes don't have emotional language. That they are actually bereft of being able to explain feelings. And the most important part was to be able to help a woman to go from this hurts to instant rage, to say there are other ways of handling this, because I used to call it orgasmic rage, because once she'd exploded and done the damage that she did to her partner or to her children, then came the calm. And we used to have to work on that, to where actually after a period of time you could see, as she began to become much more voluble, as she began to, we did a lot of poetry, women and men too, writing poems, because those were the words that are easy to start with. And then we used to sit for hours, everybody talking about feelings. So 10 o'clock in the morning, the kids went off with the play staff, who were usually virtually all men, with some women working with them. That's the first time the children knew good, kind, gentle men. And they're forbidden in refuges. The shelter movement will not allow men to work directly with children or even sometimes to come into the shelters. And I have been in here, when I was here last with Anne, we were talking about the fact that the shelter movement is actually bunkers that could brainwash women into this whole concept that they have to remain victims. And actually, they learn very quickly, if they dare to try and take responsibility for their behavior, they will be in big trouble with the sisterhood. So I had to make a decision. Was I going to join in with this massive battle against the feminists from the very beginning, or was I going to do what mattered to me and to my heart? And I chose, because I knew I wasn't going to win this battle. They were so highly organized that what I needed to do was to actually work directly with men and women and children. But I want you to understand that many of us, including some of us here, including me, had to come to terms with the fact that we were not loved. It isn't that my mother didn't want to love us. She wasn't mothered. She was very abused by her stepmother. So you see the generations coming down like this. And I think it's the responsibility of everyone to you have to look at where you've come from, what you've learned from it, why the patterns are there and why you do what you do. And also, you know, the biggest lesson I received was when I was, yet again, putting my hand out, trying to rescue, and feeling that I could see all this potential. All of us are responsible for the choices we make. I used to say to the mothers, first choice can be an accident. The second can be careless. But time you do it third time, you've really got to look at what you're doing and why you're doing it. And you see, this work went over 12 years. So by the time the women were pouring through the door, a millionaire bought me a very big house that was filled to the ceiling almost immediately. So because we had no other alternative, as a group, and we worked with men who were plumbers, they all piled in to help me. We had this huge squatting domain. Squatting, if you know, is you can take a house that isn't being used. And in those days, it was a civil offense. So my idea was you got very big houses, you put, say, 15 mothers and perhaps 30 kids in the house, and then the borough's not going to touch you because they'd have to rehouse them all. And the biggest squat I had was Palm Court Hotel in Richmond. It had 47 private suites, and we took that one night. So we got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we worked, and this huge family evolved. And the boys, which worked so well, they are all married up and matched with men who'd helped them to learn to build, to plumber, to electricity, to actually skim walls. They were the men in those boys' lives that were their mentors. And it worked. And the beautiful part of it all was I created a boys' house. And these are boys, well, boys are 18, 19, but they're 3-year-old babies. And I had this big room where we had all the toys, Tonka toys, fortresses, all the childhood toys that we don't get as battered children. Nobody bothers about toys for that because the parents are too busy warring with each other or one intimidating the other. And you see these huge lads with records of violence, with records of all sorts of things, lying on the floor, playing with the toys, with each other. And you could just see them grow. Many of the mothers would go down to the playgroup with the staff and play and sing. No one ever taught them to sing to their children. This is a possible program. This is the way we should be going. We shouldn't be sitting here having to go on yet again about what this evil empire is doing. It's doing it to men, women, and children. I want one day to make many of these women accountable. I want to actually charge them with fraud. I do. Hillary Clinton would be the first on my list. She is behind a huge amount of what's going on, and she wants to bring the Violence Against Women's Act global. Can you imagine the amount of money they can make?
Sorry, what was her name again?
Hillary Clinton. And then we have a woman called Harriet Harman. She produced a policy document. She's the Minister for Women, and she's in the Labour Party. And in the document, it states that men aren't necessarily harmonious to marriage. And that became the policy document that is now in force. Talking about the laws, we've got a new law now coming in England. I don't know if you have it here. It's called the Cinderella Law. See, what they do, the feminists behind all this, the radical feminists, they spread the definition of domestic violence so wide. This new one's called neglect. Who's going to decide what neglect is? Social workers are going to decide. And this time they're saying that children can give evidence. Now, when did we last see that? It's coming. If we can't stop it, you'll get it. It'll go to America. And then children will give evidence against not their mothers, their fathers. Sorry? Are you talking about McCarthy era sort of stuff? No, I'm actually talking about the communist regime, which is where children did give. Yes, you're right. Yes, you're right. Yes. But actually, at the end of the day, this is a group. Anytime you get a group like this, who by definition have decided that another group are actually evil, and this is the scapegoating that goes on. These men are the scapegoats. And you can drive the men out into the desert. And for a long time, and it's only just recently, and thank God for a voice for men, men have found a platform where they can get together. And that, I think, is the beginning of the massive change. Men who've stood up and said, we've had enough. We're men going our own way, MGTOW. Men who have said, we're not going to risk any longer being harassed and polarized and demonized. And now women are going to have to sit back and think, okay, where are we now? All I can say from my experience, there was a time when any time I spoke, I would have been screamed at and harassed, and there would have been pickets outside. I spoke at a big women's festival in London, and the room was packed with young women. And I ended saying, if men and women don't get together to work to stop this, then There is no future for us or our children. And you know, they all agreed. And that's my great hope. I believe that the wind of change is now coming. And what we have to look now very, very coldly is this has nothing to do, the radical feminist movement has nothing to do with the pain and suffering of people or children. They're not interested. It is an empire, and it is an evil empire. Thank you very much. And Attila, thank you.